I want to address something here about cutting nut slots. And that is what I think is a misconception about measuring. And I like to measure. If you watch any of my videos, you know that I'm a measuring guy. And it really kind of irks me. There's a couple of things that irk me. One thing is when somebody says, don't overthink it. And to me, that says, what they're saying is don't even think about it. Just do it. I'm a thinker, okay? I think about the problem in many different ways, and I take great pleasure in predicting and hitting the target. I'm sure I'm an overthinker. I think about things, I like to measure things, and I like to say, I'm going to hit 23 thousandths of an inch, and, there we go. So, that's my attitude on this. I like to measure stuff. So, when we're setting the nut slots here, the nut slot determines the height of the string off the first fret. It affects other things. It affects the action clear down the neck, really. But the main purpose of the thing is actually to set the height of the string, the action of the string, off of the first fret. One really super common way, and I do it this way too, is you want that nut slot to be exactly the same, a little bit higher actually, to allow for wear and other things, but you want it to be the same as the height of this first fret. So in other words, again, I've said this before, but if you were to fret this note right here, the height of the string, this fret determines the height of the string over the next fret, combined at the action. But this string is fret height. If you come back to here, the string is fret height. You come back to here, the string is fret height. So you come back to here, how tall should it be? Should be fret height. If you run a capo, if you play bluegrass and you run a capo on your second fret, this is just another illustration of the same thing. Same thing, okay? You run a capo in here, it's a fat neck. Put a capo on here. This is the nut slot. This nut slot doesn't make any difference anymore. This is the nut. And this is fret height. Scoot it back here. This is the nut. Fret height. Take it back here. Put it on the nut. That's the nut. How high should the string be? Fret height. Okay? Now the thing is how you get it there. Lots of different ways to do this, but I'm not going to talk about, I've already talked about them in another video, all the different techniques, the pros and cons of each and blah, blah, blah. The way that I do it is to rough it in by holding the string down here at the second fret. You don't want to hold it in the middle. You don't want to take it and squish it all the way to the fingerboard because you're going to pry the string up. You just want to put it right there on that second fret and gently hold it on the fret. And then you want to see ever so slight clearance off that top of that first fret right there. Tiny bit. Now, here's where the misunderstanding comes in. I measure, but I do not measure. In other words, I can tell you this. I can tell you action. I like to see 93 thousandths of an inch on the action. That depends upon having the correct fret slot, and that depends upon having minimal neck relief. Then, after those conditions are met, then I like to see 93 thousandths. And that can be a pretty hard and fast number. But when I'm talking about the action here on the first fret, it's not necessarily a hard and a fast number. So if you just took a 12 thousandths of an inch feeler gauge and set this to 12 thousandths of an inch right there, and then went and adjusted your saddle, then this is going to be off. Simply because geometry. If you push your string down right here, right now, you can see this moving. So the saddle affects this. So that's why you put your finger here and you get this out of the way and you measure. But I still like to measure the gap. But what I do, this is the misunderstanding. I hold this at the first fret here, gently. And I come up here with a set of feeler gauge and I measure the gap at the first fret. And in this case, it's just a little, it's less than 12 thousandths of an inch. This is dependent upon the saddle, but it's also relative. So the whole cone right here, from the nut to here, is relative. So if I reach up and jack this thing up like this, and then do this and measure this, here, I'm going to get a much bigger gap, obviously. That's fine, because then this gap is going to be bigger. So you can do the third fret and measure this gap, and then you can do the second fret and you can measure that gap, and then you can do the first fret and you can measure this gap, and you'll have a line of numbers coming down, which is what I call the extrapolation technique, and then you fill in what the first fret open should be with the line of those numbers. So I'm going to reach over here, I'm going to pull this action up really, really high just for fun, okay? So we can really get a big gap here. Let's just say that this is going to be 25 thousandths of an inch. I'm going to move back here, and let's just say that this is now 20 thousandths of an inch on this fret. I'm going to move back here, and let's say this is 18 thousandths of an inch. Okay? Boom. So if this one's 18, then what should this one be? 16. You know? Whatever those numbers tell you that they should be. Actually, I think they go the other way. They go bigger. But that's okay. Point is, find out for yourself. Measure. I've done this so many times that I short-circuit the whole process. And I just go here to the first fret, and I hold it at the first fret, and I measure what the action is at the second fret. And like I said, 12 thousandths is not clearing, so it's probably closer to 10. And I don't have a 10 in this set of feeler gauges. Let's see what 8 looks like. So I'm going to hold it here at the first. I'm going to measure this gap at the second fret. 8 thousandths is just clearing. I mean, I'm going to call it 8 thousandths of an inch, because you have to be consistent on how much gap you use. You can never measure exactly, because you don't know if it's clearing or not. If you ever lay out concrete, you don't run your string and then put the board smack up against it, because you can't tell then if you're pushing on the string. You always leave about 1/8 of an inch between the board and the string, and you can look down there and you can see it consistently 1/8 of an inch. But if your board touches the string, you can't tell if you're pushing the string or not. So it's the same thing here when you're using feeler gauges. You're going to have a sliver of light, and you have to have a consistent sliver of light. So 8 thousandths of an inch is clearing, so that means that this open should be about 10 thousandths of an inch. Now, the nut slot's going to wear over time. Various reasons why you would not want to set that exactly at 10 thousandths of an inch. So you fudge it up another 2 thousandths of an inch, so 12 thousandths of an inch. Again, I cannot stress this enough. That 12 thousandths of an inch is not a static, set in concrete number. It's totally dependent upon the saddle, and to another extent the relief. But I've already set the relief. Set the relief first, then do the nut slots, then do the saddle. I know this saddle is going to be good because I'm just making a new nut for this guitar because I didn't like the spacing on it anyway. So I know I'm already good on these two things. So, but these numbers are going to be fluid depending on what that saddle is and what this relief is. So don't take 12 thousandths of an inch as just a blind number that you're trying to hit. Use the extrapolation technique, measure this, fret at the first fret, measure this gap, and then increase this gap by 2 thousandths of an inch, 4 thousandths of an inch, whatever you think is your number. I go with 4 thousandths of an inch higher because it needs to be 2 higher, and then I'm going to give it 2 more to allow for wear and allow for other things. So I got 8 thousandths of an inch here, and I'm going to see 12 thousandths of an inch on that nut slot. Okay? I think people very much misunderstand this because they don't try to grasp the concept that we're trying to present here. And the concept is to do an extrapolation technique. And in order to do extrapolation, you have to start with some measurements so that you get the extrapolation. You can't extrapolate out of 0. So 12 thousandths of an inch, and now I'm going to test it. I think I just did it. And I'm going to slide this into there, and I have a tiny air gap. So in reality, this is probably 13 thousandths of an inch, and there we go. I'm happy. So I do the same thing on all of these. And so what I find out when I go to the B string here, I'm going to take that 12 and I'm going to slide it into here, and it doesn't go. It doesn't make it. They'll vary because the saddle is varying, and lots of other things are varying. So second 8 again, fretted at the first fret, and we got a pretty good clearance under here. And so, you know, I think that's probably a good solid 9 or 10 thousandths of an inch in reality if I had a laser beam to measure it. So, given that, I still want this B string to be about 12 thousandths, and if it's just a smidgen higher, that's cool. And I come in here and I can see just a little air. It's probably 13. I don't think it's going to be 14. And that's cool. I've already set it. So 14 goes just barely. I could hit that one more swipe at the follow, but I'm not gonna, because 14 is still pretty good here. So there you go. I think people misunderstand that when I personally talk about measuring for the nut slot. The reason I like to measure is just because it's a check. One way is to hold it down right here and get that gap, but a second way, a check. I am big on redundant checks. I am so big on redundant checks. I want to check this thing from 2 or 3 different aspects and see if I come up with the predicted consistent answer. The second reason I like to actually measure that gap is because it's a whole lot easier to see a 12 thousandths of an inch gap than it is a 2 thousandths of an inch gap. 2 thousandths and 1 thousandths are just, man, I can't tell. But if you're looking at 12 versus 14 versus 16, it's a bigger gap. It's easier to measure. So 2 reasons. Redundant check, and it's a bigger gap, and so it's easier to measure. Okay? So I'm going to do the rest of these, and you can watch if you want to, or you can hang up right now and go do something else. Go play video games or whatever you want to do. So, yeah, or you can hang on. So I'm going to the G. I don't think I've done the G yet. Yeah, I did. It's just a little above 16, so I'm going to hold it at the first fret. Let's get an actual measurement on that G string. If you're hanging in here, let's actually measure these numbers. I'm going to get the 11 out of the way. Let's start with an 8. Let's go up to the 3rd fret on the G string, and I'm going to measure the gap at the 4th fret. Eight thousandths of an inch is just barely going. It helps so much when you do this to get a light back here, and you watch the shadow of the string on the feeler gauge. People come in with feeler gauges and they tilt them and they tilt them and they do all this. And learning to use your tool is 95% of the deal, you know. I am just so comfortable with feeler gauges. I've been using them for 50 years, you know. Using them to adjust engines and stuff before that. In fact, this came out of my toolbox 20 years ago. So I am very comfortable with feeler gauges, and it's just a matter of being comfortable with the tool. But I see lots of guys come in and tilt the feeler gauges, and they're not comfortable with the tool, you know. So anyway, 8 thousandths of an inch, 3rd fret. Yeah. So now we're going to back up. I'm going to hold the 2nd fret. I'm going to measure at the 3rd. And the gap is just a hair bigger. It's probably 9 thousandths of an inch in reality. Come back here. I'm hold the 1st fret. And we're definitely getting bigger. I don't think I'm going to get a 12 in there. Let's see. I bet I could get a 10. Let's try an 11. 1st fret, G string. I'm getting the 11. I would call it 10. So we got an 8, we got a 10. That means the open ought to be 12 thousandths of an inch. 8, 10, 12. 12 is cutting it pretty close. A little too close. I'm going to go with 14 and possibly even 16. So here's 14 thousandths of an inch. I got plenty of room. Let's try the 16. And I got a little bit of a gap. So 16 is a little bit on the large side. It's probably really about 18 thousandths of an inch because I can see a gap. So we're going to take 1 or 2 more swipes on this. You need a little bit of margin so you don't overfile, because that does happen. That's a drag. That's another reason why you don't want to take it right to the mark, because if you go a little bit over, you're dead. And see, I've got a lot of gap here, so when I check this air gap, I've got a pretty good air gap. I don't think I'm pushing it. I'm going to go for 16. And still got a little bit. I got about another 2 thousandths of an inch that I can go. And remember, 16 is already being generous because it could be 12. The GoPro overheated and I had to let it cool off for a minute. I have to plug the charger in when I'm using a microphone, and the combination of the charging and the microphone, all that, and no airflow overheats it. Anyway, I got this nut done, and it was in another video that we showed of making the nut. I measured everything, and then when I get done, I come over here, and there is still that tiny little gap right there. So both specs were good, but my gaps now are really perfectly even here. When you're working with just the gap, you can get one gap that's a little bit off. You know, like I said, 1 thousandths, even 100 thousandths of an inch. And then when you go to fret that open string, it's 2 thousandths or 3 thousandths of an inch, and it feels funny. I just feel like I can get really, really precise nut slots this way, and this is the way I do it. So, you know, again, I just want to emphasize that don't misunderstand the technique of measuring. It is an extrapolation technique. It's not a static, one measurement fits all. It's an extrapolation that depends upon the saddle and depends upon the neck relief to some extent. Set the neck relief first, do the nut slots, then do the other. But it gives you a bigger gap to measure, and it also really helps me find little discrepancies between them. So like one might be 2 thousandths and one might be 3 thousandths of an inch, and it really helps me get a nice even measurement. So, all right, this guitar's done.